Season 2 of Teen Titans opens up on an interesting choice. This episode, How Long Is Forever, focuses on Starfire. It does have quite a bit of the other Titans in it, but it doesn't really serve as character development for them as we know them now. The episode starts out with Starfire all excited. She is planning to celebrate the Tamarinian holiday of Warthog with her friends, as it is a holiday which specifically celebrates friendship and sort of serves to reaffirm the bonds of friendship going forward, ensuring that the friendships will last. But the other Titans are just being absolutely horrible to each other, and she ends up kind of blowing up at them, something that is very out of character for her, but I think actually very warranted in this case. But before anything can really be resolved, they get called out to a robbery, though Robin does have time to assure her that they will always be friends. And even if you don't take away from his statement that the entire group will always be friends, you can take away that he does expect the two of them to always be friends. But then again, they're obviously romantically interested in each other, so he says that with that in mind, consciously or not. And therefore I have trouble believing that it 100% pertains to this situation. Anyway, they arrive at the scene of the robbery, and this guy in high-tech power armor calling himself Warp is trying to steal this. I don't even know what it was. Is it like an art piece that's supposed to look like a clock, or is it a really nice clock? It's never really explained. It's kind of implied for just a second or so at the very beginning that it's tech that he needs for his whole time traveler theme, but then he talks about how he wants to sell it. He's from the future, 100 years in the future, and 100 years in the future, it's known that this clock disappears on this day. This has led him to realize that he must steal it, take it to the future where it no longer exists, and sell it for huge quantities of money. So I guess that's all it is. I guess it's just a really nice art piece that looks like a clock, or it's a really nice clock being treated as an art piece. It doesn't really matter, honestly, but I did get a little more hung up on this than I would like to, so need to vent very briefly. This guy curb stomps them. He has all this future technology, which is on par with their abilities, and he also knows how they fight from the history records. But as he opens up a wormhole back to his future, Starfire gets super passionate and flies right up to him and follows him into the portal. They clash in the time stream, and she damages his time control device, which is right in the middle of his chest, because that's the best place to put it for sure. Rather than being deposited 100 years in the future, they end up only 20 years in the future instead. This does give her a second chance to confront Warp though, but that's not really what's important to her at this point. What is important to her is that she goes and finds her friends, who from her perspective seem to have disappeared. She goes to the tower first, and she finds Cyborg, who informs her that it's been 20 years. She hasn't realized that yet. He is older, and he seems to be in disrepair. He's even hooked up to the tower's power systems because, as he puts it, his last power cell died a long time ago. And no future technology is compatible with him anymore, so he can't repair himself fully. He also informs her that the Titans broke up. They fell apart, and it's implied that it's very shortly after she disappeared from their timeline, going through Warp's wormhole, as the beads that she planned to give them for the celebration of Globgor are still right there on the floor. Star takes it in stride that she has traveled through time, and she doesn't dwell on the fact that Cyborg seems trapped in the tower. It's obvious that it's painful to her, and it's obvious that the idea that the team broke up is painful to her. But Warp is still out there, he is still dangerous, and he's still getting away with this thing that he stole. And also, Star would really like help getting back to her own time. That's a problem too. And she just can't believe that her friends wouldn't help her if they have the opportunity to. And so she finds Beast Boy, who is in a cage. He's in one of those traveling circus cages, performing for people, transforming from one animal to the next. Which actually reminds me, there's a detail in this scene that I really like. The kids who are kind of harassing him through the bars of his cage. The style of clothing that they're wearing is very reminiscent of the styles of clothing in the Dark Knight Returns comic. I just thought that was neat enough to be worth pointing out. It doesn't really impact the story at all. Anyway, she finds Beast Boy, and dang, this last 20 years has not been kind to him. He looks like crap, and he insists that he wants to stay in this cage because the bars aren't there to keep him in. They're there to keep everyone else out, which is really weird. Beast Boy's future is the weirdest of all of these, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So she goes and finds Raven next, and I don't even know where she's supposed to be. Like, it's kind of implied that Raven's gone a little loopy, so maybe it's supposed to be an asylum, but I don't know, and I don't really want to think about that. But it is clear that Raven doesn't believe that she's there, which implies that after Starfire disappeared originally, Raven was so affected by it that she started to see visions of Starfire when she wasn't there, to the point that she now doesn't believe her when she sees her right in front of her face. And Star doesn't know where to go to find Robin. She knew where to go to find Beast Boy and Raven because Cyborg knew where they were, but he has had such a falling out with Robin that he doesn't even know where to start looking. And so Starfire just goes wandering the city, and she actually comes upon Warp again, who has also aged, but they don't explain that either. Like, if you guys haven't been following up to this point, there's a lot of stuff that they just don't explain in this episode. Starfire still has the piece of his suit that she ripped off while they were fighting in the time stream, and he needs it to get back to his time. And he starts going on and on about how time can't change, it's immutable. You can't damage the future because you can't alter the past. Everything has already happened. That's how he knew to steal the clock. He knew that it got stolen, and he was able to deduce that he was the one who stole it. He looks around at this future, which is horrifying in many ways, not just in the personal ways for Starfire, but we'll get to that again in a minute. And he sees history, whereas Starfire sees something that she's desperate to change. Starfire can't stand up to Warp on her own, but that's when Robin shows up. But he's not Robin anymore. He's Nightwing, his superhero persona that he took on after he was done being Robin. This is such a cool nod to the comic book version of the character, and one that I didn't really expect to see in this show when I first saw it. Robin is the first character that we see who does actually seem 20 years older. Everyone else seems like they've aged more than that, except maybe Raven, but she's so far gone at this point that it doesn't really matter. Point is, Robin seems mostly normal, and he seems to be the only one who believed that after Star disappeared, she would come back. It's implied through dialogue that that might even be what drove the team apart. That after Starfire disappeared, a period of time after Starfire disappeared, he kept insisting that she would come back, but the others wanted to move on. And if you look at Raven's condition as she was literally driven insane by all of this, you can kind of understand why the other characters would want to move on, to help her to move on and heal. And that Robin's insistence that they live in the past and keep waiting for Starfire, keep waiting for Starfire to come back, would have been reason enough for the others to distance themselves from him. None of this is explained in the episode, but we can at least infer this much. There's so much more about this future that we can't infer, like Cyborg saying that his technology is obsolete, even though he should have been capable of upgrading his technology as things went on, implies that he's been through a lot more than is even really implied to us. That something else must have happened to break his spirits so completely. And the fact that Beast Boy is happy locking himself in a flimsy cage as his only means of defense from the outside world, performing for people, seemingly so that he's not harmed, coupled with the fact that he says that he tried being a solo hero for a while, but that it didn't work out for him, and the fact that when Star goes walking through the city, it seems almost entirely abandoned, all adds up to paint a picture of a future where something happened and people who weren't entirely normal became the target of prejudice so extreme that they are in danger if they go outside, that they're in danger if they leave themselves out in the open. This explains why Cyborg is so content to stay in the tower. This explains why Beast Boy is so content to stay in that cage. It may have even contributed to Raven's mental illness. And as your mind starts to piece these things together, you wonder, if the Titans hadn't broken up, could they have fixed this? And honestly, that's my one problem with this episode. I would have rather this episode came later in the season when it was more appropriate to do a two-parter, where they could have done like a two-parter and given us more of the backstory of this messed up history. But then at the same time, I'm left remembering that this is a kids show, so maybe it is best to leave the implied stuff implied. Point is, now that Starfire is reunited with Robin, he uses an old Teen Titans communicator to contact the others, and despite the fact that they claim that they've all fallen apart and that they've all moved on, Raven still has her communicator, Beast Boy still has his communicator, and Cyborg has kept the communicator built into himself repaired enough that he gets the signal. Not knowing if their friends are going to come to aid them, Robin and Starfire go looking for Warp, not just to recover the thing that he stole, but also to get Starfire home if possible. And they do well. Robin is considerably more skilled now than he was in the past, but it still seems that Warp is going to defeat them until Cyborg shows up. They make a point of having Cyborg be the first one to arrive. Not just because they have the other Titans show up in the order that Starfire met them in the future, but also to show us that he was severely over-exaggerating how trapped he was. That on some level, him being trapped in that tower was his own choice. It's been, what, like maybe an hour tops, and he is now fully functional. He doesn't even have to carry like an external battery pack or anything. Beast Boy shows up next, and we see that he is just as effective as a hero as he was 20 years ago, if not more. Followed by Raven, who seems to have more of her comic book powers. These characters are just as powerful as they used to be, and they work together just as well as they used to be. In fact, they almost seem stronger, they almost seem more cohesive because now they're older and have more experience. They steamroll over Warp, and Cyborg even proves that he is not as obsolete as he says that he was, when he interfaces immediately with Warp's still 80 years too advanced technology and sends Starfire home. Before she leaves, she expresses the sentiment that she wishes that she could help them, these future versions of her friends. And so once she arrives back in her own time, she tells everyone what happened in the hopes that they can prevent it from happening again, because after all, she recovered the clock that was supposed to disappear from her time forever on the day that Warp first arrived. But it's back in the exact spot that Warp was supposed to steal it from. Warp claimed that time was immutable, that time couldn't be changed, but Starfire has proven that wrong. And so whereas in the original version of this timeline where Starfire disappeared, her friends all fell apart, they instead come together to celebrate the holiday of Groundhog with her, despite the fact that none of them has any idea what it is, because Starfire apparently didn't tell them that it was coming up and just expected them to know. Oh yeah, and also they defeated Warp by accidentally turning him back into a baby with his own technology, which is apparently a risk of his power suit. And then he stayed 20 years in the future with the future Titans, even though that timeline was erased the moment that Starfire stepped back into her own past, implying that Warp doesn't exist anymore at all. But then again, changing the future did also erase his entire future from existence, probably, so I'm going to try not to think about that. This is a fantastic episode. It's really weird to put it at the start of a season. I kind of implied that earlier. But I also kind of get why they put it here. They wanted to show us this crazy, messed up future version of the Titans so that we'd have something to gauge the future of the show against. I get that, but it's still weird. But just because it's not the placement within the series that I would have chosen, that doesn't mean that this episode is bad. And like I already said, it's very good. And not just because you can pick up on this sort of implied dystopian-esque future, but because the character interactions here are top-notch. Just from the behavior of the Titans, you can infer how it was that each of them fell out of the group. Raven was so wounded by Starfire's disappearance that she lost faith in anyone. Cyborg and Beast Boy just gave up on their futures. Robin is really the only one who seems at all healthy in the future, but even he has been obsessed with Starfire's return, with keeping the faith that Starfire would return all of these years. Making him Nightwing in this future, I'm sure, was even to help illustrate that, because Nightwing is a character very much like Batman, and Batman is a character defined by his obsessions. Starfire is the heart of this team, and this episode really solidifies that. You can infer that the entire team fell apart because she wasn't there to keep them together. Which just goes to solidify what I feel was the moral of this episode, that good enough friends, they stop being just friends and become part of your family. The characters at the start of this episode weren't acting like friends or roommates, as Robin said. They were acting like family. They were acting like family, living under one roof, getting on each other's nerves. And that is just such a wholly appropriate depiction of the Titans' relationship with one another. The Titans in the comics are more family to each other than most of their families. And as counterintuitive as it may sound, it can be so much easier for family to have a falling out than friends. Obviously, the entire burden of keeping their group together shouldn't be on Starfire, but the episode doesn't really imply that it is, just that she's the catalyst for all of it. That losing her suddenly might be traumatic enough to catalyze things in the other direction and break them apart. Now, as I implied, this episode doesn't really explain a lot. Like, why was Warp so sure that history couldn't be changed, and yet it was changed so easily? Why did Warp age 20 years in the future when Starfire didn't? Did some of the stuff that we see later on in this series happen in this alternate future in alternate ways? If so, were those events the events that led to this dystopian-esque future? Because I honestly can't really see how. But when it comes right down to it, Warp and the future settings and the future characters are all really window dressing to explore the relationship between these characters, so it doesn't really matter. The stuff that was in the focus in this episode, in the foreground in this episode, was handled well enough that while I would like some of these plot holes to be filled, at the end of the day, they don't bother me enough for me to care. Which is a weird thing for me to say, let me tell you. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to know, what did you think of this episode of Teen Titans if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.